Thank you very much. I want to thank ISI and Miriam in particular for making it possible for me to address you. This is not the first time that I've been at the University of Dallas. It's always a very special pleasure and privilege for me to come back and to remind myself that there's at least one university in the United States that has some idea of what it's trying to do. And you have no idea how unusual that is in today's landscape. I'm going to begin by what happened to me today, and then I'm going to lead into the main lecture. Before going to the airport to catch my plane to Dallas, I went to the post office. And I had to wait a long time in line, or at least it seemed a long time to me, dealing with the usual inefficiencies of the post office. And I started looking at the stamps that were there for sale. And then something interesting occurred to me, and that is, what kinds of things get on United States stamps? What kinds of people appear on United States stamps? Presidents, political leaders in general, entertainers like Elvis Presley, baseball players, superheroes like Spider-Man, for example. I'm a big fan of Spider-Man, but of course I recognize that he's a fictional character. What is very rare to find on an American stamp is the picture of an entrepreneur or a business person. Okay, so for some strange reason, even though commerce is an important part of our culture, one might almost say a defining part of American culture, it's not recognized or honored by the United States Post Office. If one were to try to resuscitate thousands of years now American culture, and all you had as an artifact were stamps, imagine what sort of impression you would get of what this culture is about. And I suppose the same thing could be said about advertisements on television, for example, for Viagra and things, that one would have to conclude this is an incredibly dysfunctional society in lots of ways. All right, I'm going to try to tell you a story about commerce. Even though my original discipline is philosophy, I take the view that human beings fundamentally only understand themselves if they give some kind of narrative or historical account. That's ultimately how we make sense of ourselves. And in the modern period, there have been two narratives. One narrative is usually referred to as the Lockean narrative, and it tries to make sense of the modern world in terms of a commercial republic. And the other narrative, very often referred to as the Rousseau-Marx narrative, is really a narrative of complaint by a bunch of people who can't seem to make it in Locke's world, rather than a serious alternative. So what I'm going to do is to give you the Capaldi version of the Locke narrative. And I'm going to begin with, you'll see why I begin this way, and then later I'll explain rhetorically why it's one beginning at one point rather than another. Because ultimately I expect to give you a kind of circular account. I'm going to begin with something I call the technological project. One of the things, perhaps the most important thing that distinguishes the modern world from the classical medieval world is the technological project. And by that, I mean the following. In the classical world, people thought in terms of conforming to nature. That, by the way, is the standard view that's held. I would say if you were to count heads in the world today, that's the understanding that most people have. Right. What the technological project maintains is that we are not here to conform to the physical world. We are here to transform the physical world. And the writers who were instrumental in articulating that point of view would be people like Bacon, Descartes, and Locke. In fact, in Descartes' Discourse on Method, which I'm sure you have read at one point or another, he makes a statement which I think is a perfect way of capturing what the technological project was all about. He says, we are here to make ourselves the masters and possessors of nature. The masters and possessors of nature. And in his correspondence, he said, the reason I published the book at this time, he was writing to someone else, is that I lived 1 year longer than I have a right to expect. And part of his concern, of course, was medical technology. He was 36 when he wrote the book, because at the time that Descartes was writing, average life expectancy was 35 years. To put this into further perspective, in 1900, average life expectancy in the United States was 47. If you were 50, you were really old in every conceivable sense. Average life expectancy by 2000 is now 78 or higher, and people at this point are talking about 100, 120 as the norm. So the technological project then is this massive change in attitude about how human beings relate to the physical world. I would make the following claims on behalf of the technological project. All right, some qualifications. Clearly, the technological project creates new challenges and problems for us. Okay? I'm not going to discuss those now, but I'll be happy to entertain your comments about that later. What I will say is that at this point in history, the technological project is irreversible. There is no going back. It is not possible at this point to say that we're going to do away with technology. In fact, I'm sure if I went around the room and asked each of you to mention some respect in which technology has transformed your life, you can probably think of a good many examples, and some of us probably wouldn't even be here this evening if it weren't for the advances in medical technology. So it's an irreversible process. The people who complain about it can only complain about it by using technology, and the people who want to destroy it can only do so by, in fact, using the internet, cell phones, etc. So there's something somewhat incoherent about anybody who challenges it. The other point I would make about the technological project is that even when it creates problems for us, our immediate response is to assume that future technology will solve the problems created by present technology. Now, do we know that as a matter of fact? No, none of us knows that as a matter of fact, but that is a basic assumption with which we operate. So I'm identifying that as a major presupposition on which the modern world is founded, that there's this irreversible historical development where we now see ourselves as trying to control the physical universe instead of merely conforming to it. This particular idea starts in the West rather than elsewhere. In fact, one of the questions that's frequently raised by historians of science and technology is, why is it that the scientific revolution occurred in the West and not, say, in China? If you were to look at China, say, in the 14th century and compare it to Western Europe in the 14th century, what you would have discovered is that the Chinese were much more accurate in their observations, and they had discovered all kinds of stuff that was not available in the West. And so if we were really looking at what they knew as opposed to what people in the West knew, there would be no comparison in answering the question which was the superior civilization from a scientific point of view. But the technological project did not take off in China, rather it took off in Western Europe. The explanation for this is that the technological project is a product of the Judeo-Christian heritage. It is precisely because we believe that the world was created by God, that He created it in an orderly fashion, that He's willing to share knowledge of that order with us, and that the order is benevolently disposed to us. Without making those assumptions, the technological project makes no sense, right? But our optimistic assumption that there is an order and that it is benevolently disposed to us is one of the reasons that the technological project, in a sense, begins in Western Europe as opposed to any place else in the world, and continues to be the place where the technological project is taken seriously. So that's the first historical fact. Second point I want to make is that what we have discovered is that in order to be successful in carrying out this technological project, we need a certain kind of person who thinks in a particular way. What that means essentially is people who are willing to compete, to think outside the box, to engage in innovative thinking, to come up with models, and then try to find out whether the models make any sense in the world in which we live. The economic system that is most conducive to the success of the technological project is a free market economy. Now, this has been known since the 18th century. If you had read Hume and Adam Smith, they would make it perfectly clear to you why it is that free market economy is the best economy for carrying out the technological project. Unfortunately, it took the rest of the world about 2 centuries to kind of catch up and understand this. That's usually the way things work. And so why do we read these people? Because they go back and say, if you had paid attention to these texts earlier, we've saved ourselves a lot of trouble. By 1989, so I'll give 1989 as a significant date, with the collapse of the evil empire, the world now accepts that there is no alternative to a free market economy in terms of trying to achieve economic success within an industrial and technological economy. That's something to which everybody at least pays lip service, even if they don't fully understand it. Now, economists will give you all kinds of good reasons and lots of reasons for why free market economies are better. At least the economists who are my friends. But I still want to maintain that the free market makes sense to us much more because of the technological project than for any other reason. So I'll give you now a little bit of information about this, other than the fact that say that you can read about this in Hume and Adam Smith. I'm going to tell an apocryphal story. The apocryphal story concerns Gorbachev, as who I understand was here yesterday. I hope all of you know what apocryphal means. Okay. When President Reagan was president of the United States, Gorbachev came to visit, and presumably on this trip they went to Silicon Valley because Gorbachev wanted to see what the American computer industry was up to, and he brought along with him his best expert on computer technology. And so they take a tour of Silicon Valley and goes to look at all these places. And at the end of the tour, Gorbachev turns to his advisor and he says, how far behind the Americans are we? And his expert says, 10 years. And then the second question is, where are we going to be 10 years from now? And the expert says, 20 years behind. The point is, we're never going to catch up because we just have a system that is unable to capture the creative energies of individuals. Innovation is not something you can plan. You could probably give a course and call your course planned innovation, all right? But everybody would know that that makes no sense. In the same way that you can give a course called creative writing. Creative writing doesn't really teach you how to be creative. What it does is introduce you to the work of creative people, and maybe by osmosis you might get something out of it. But you can't reduce this to an algorithm. So a market economy is absolutely crucial to the functioning of the technological project. Now, I would also argue here that Christianity plays a major part in our understanding of market economies. One of the constants in church history is the defense of the institution of private property, which is absolutely essential. So, in fact, it's part of the definition of a free market economy. You don't have a central allocation of resources. Rather, resources are spread out amongst lots of people who can do what they want with it and compete, etc. So there's no central planning involved. While there's also a long history of people who have tried to construe Christianity as a form of socialism. In fact, the church has always been very clear on this, that private property is essential, and certainly by the time we got to Pope John Paul II, it became perfectly clear that this Pope understood more than any other the value of a market economy as opposed to the kind of inefficiency and moral degradation that comes about when you attempt to plan economies. Surely his experience in Poland had taught him that. And he was much more aggressive about seeing the value of markets as a way of responding to a whole variety of social problems. So I would argue then that the first two units of my story, namely the technological project, would not make any sense except as a result of Judeo-Christian heritage. That free market economy is something that has always been promoted in one way or another by the Catholic Church and by most forms of Christianity. Now I'm going to get to the third element in the story. The third element in the story is limited government. The notion that the role of government is to provide the conditions within which the market can flourish. Not to run the market, but to make the market possible. So a limited government understands its subsidiary role, not its directing role, and it does things like what? Protect private property, protect the rights of individuals, provide for the enforcement of contracts, for the adjudication of disputes where they come up. Perhaps the best writing I can give to indicate to you that this is a new understanding of the role of government, namely its relationship to a commercial society. The economy is to refer you both to the Federalist Papers and specifically to Federalist Paper number 10 written by Madison, where he makes it perfectly clear that government is involved here in helping to smooth out the kinds of inevitable conflicts that are going to arise when you have a number of competing commercial interests. In fact, the entire Federalist Papers, in a sense, reflects that attitude and that understanding. There are only two authors that the writers of the Federalist Papers refer to. Fortunately for us, it's not full of footnotes like the stuff I have to write. Okay, who are the two authors referred to in the Federalist Papers? Only two. And it's not Aristotle and it's not Locke. Okay, Hume and Montesquieu. Okay, so they clearly had read Hume. In fact, Pepper's paper 10 is Madison's rewriting of one of Hume's essays, or several of his essays. And Montesquieu, of course, was among the one of the first moderns to understand the importance of a commercial republic as opposed to a classical agrarian republic. So they wanted to preserve the virtues of a republic and thought that they could do this on a larger scale if you had a commercial society. And that was always a big concern. If you study the history of the West, one of the things, problems that always comes up is why were the Athenians unable to create a stable order? Why were the Romans unable to do this over a long period of time? And that's because they did not have a sense of commerce in a republic that could operate on a large scale. And when they attempted to operate on a large scale, their republics collapsed and were replaced by something else. But somehow the founding fathers and moderns got to understand this. And just as an aside, this is an ongoing conflict in American history. In part, the Civil War was a conflict between two visions of America: a Jeffersonian vision of an agrarian society and a Hamiltonian vision of a commercial society. And it's clear which one won in the end, although we still continue to be plagued by problems connected with that. So, limited government. Now, what is the origin of the notion of limited government? Again, let me suggest that the Judeo-Christian tradition makes that possible. So when you look around the world and see where have people attempted to limit the government, what you find is that in the West, in the Christian West, this has been an important part of our tradition. In fact, as Lord Acton argued, the history of Christianity is to a very large extent the history of freedom. I'll just point to one person who I think played a crucial role in that, is that of St. Augustine. It is St. Augustine who did what Loyola referred to as the de-divinization of the state. I remember Logos in German, so Augustine used all these difficult expressions like immanentizing, the eschaton, etc. But de-divinizing the state. What he means by that is that for Augustine, fulfillment does not come in public political life. That's a Greek and Roman idea, where you give yourself over to the city. Augustine argues that fulfillment comes in your private spiritual life, private in the sense of not being public, not private in the sense that you're disconnected from other people. So real fulfillment comes in your spiritual life. The public discourse, the public arena is just, and government are just there to lock up the bad guys so that it has a negative function, not a positive function. So I would suggest that the very idea that there is a private realm that is more important than the political realm is something that Christians understand, and that is exactly why Western Christianity has consistently promoted the idea that politics is not the end all and be all. Politics is here to serve us, not actually to run our lives. Now, one interesting comment in connection with this is that St. Augustine was read in the West. He was not read in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. So the Orthodox tradition was completely different from the Western tradition. In fact, in the Orthodox tradition, down to very recent times, the head of the church was also the head of the state. That was certainly true in the case of Russia. They had no notion of the separation of two. So the separation of church and state, so to speak, I know that's a kind of awful expression to use, but the person who first advocated that was Augustine, and he advocated that to protect the church from being overrun and controlled by political authorities. So, and I think down to the present time, I think that's an important consideration. So the technological project can't be understood apart from its Christian origins. Market economies can be understood better if you see that one of the major institutions of the West has always promoted the notion of private property, and limited government is an important part of the Western tradition, precisely because the Judeo-Christian tradition has always promoted the idea that we are not here to serve the state, that the state is somehow here to serve us. So that's a very vital and important part of Christian history. Now, the next element in the story is the notion of the rule of law. One of the ways in which we limit the government, or even think in terms of limiting the government, is through our notion of the rule of law. Now, it's taken a long time to go through the whole history of this, so I'll just make a few general observations. the interesting thing about the rule of law, it doesn't mean that you have a legal system or the rule of lawyers, etc. What it means is that you have a legal system that is guided by a particular principle. And what is that principle? Principle is that the law should be focused on process, not outcome. Right? Or another way of putting it is that judges are supposed to adhere to due process. They are not supposed to use the law to try to achieve their private objectives, whether those objectives are economic, political, social, aesthetic, whatever. Okay? That is not the job of the judge. The judge is to interpret the law, not to make the law, to show how it applies to novel cases. But again, the emphasis is on the process, not using it to achieve a particular objective. And here, I would mention, if you're interested in pursuing this, the people who have the most to say about this are P.C. who's a British jurist of the late 19th century. Hayek, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, who's written, I think, the best stuff on the common law tradition. Ron Fuller, famous American jurist, and Michael Oakeshott, one of my favorite thinkers. 20th century British political theorist, has been dead now for about a decade. The other point I would make is that the common law tradition is the only one in which you will find the rule of law. That sounds strange to you, because all kinds of countries claim to have the rule of law. China claims to have the rule of law. Nazi Germany claims to have the rule of law. Even Iran claims to have the rule of law. It's because they're using the definition of it that has very little to do with our definition. They have rule through law, not the rule of law. It's a very, very big difference. But I would maintain that the rule of law is unique to the Anglo-American legal tradition in any country that derives its legal system from that. And part of the explanation for that is two elements. I'll just mention these in passing, because these are not usually included in a normal curriculum. I think they're worth noting. You should always be reminded that part of the point of a good education is that you always learn that there's more stuff you didn't know. Okay. So those of us who are really well educated realize the immense ignorance that we have to deal with. So the Germanic tribes that invaded the Roman Empire, there were several of them. Among my favorites are the Vandals, the Visigoths, the Angles, and the Saxons. Okay, where did the Angles and the Saxons settle? You get one guess. You know where they settled, in England, of course. And they kept up the tradition that the Germanic tribes had of decentralized power. The problem with the other Germanic tribes is that this is one of those cases where the victors adopted the culture of the people they conquered. So they Romanized themselves, and they ended up adopting the Roman system of law, and that, as it comes down to us in Justinian's Code, and Justinian's Code says the emperor is above the law. So they don't have any conception that there is nobody above the law, that including Supreme Court justices, and that the system has to learn how to check itself. So this is a unique attribute of the Anglo-American system, and I would also argue it explains in part why countries in the Anglosphere have been economically more successful than countries that use another legal system. My favorite example of this, of course, is Louisiana. It is the only state that continues to use the civilian tradition as opposed to a 100% common law tradition. And we are the state with the most corruption and the least amount of development. If I told you that I lived in a place that had a port at the mouth of the biggest river in the United States, that we produced a tremendous amount of oil and natural gas, that we have all this wonderful food and indigenous local culture, etc. This must be heaven. You must be living in one of the world's major financial centers. No, I regret to say that I live in New Orleans, or the New Orleans area. Okay. So I don't have time to argue this to great length. Nevertheless, I would point out that this would be an interesting way of in part, explaining one of the many, many reasons why southern Louisiana has the problems that it does. So it's the rule of law that is now necessary in order to make the government operate the way it does by limiting its power, because we take for granted that individuals are not supposed to game the system for their advantage, but rather in the rule of law society, there are rules for how each of us can pursue what we want to pursue as long as we don't interfere with someone else. But there's no notion that the whole system is supposed to have an objective. Now I come to the last part of the story. And I'm going to refer to this Okay, my usual way of referring to this is to talk about a culture of personal autonomy. Okay. I was planning not to use that expression at the University of Dallas because there are a number of faculty here who are also my friends. Whenever they hear the word autonomy, they go ballistic on me. It's like raising a red flag. So I said, okay, tonight I'm going to talk about a culture that promotes freedom and personal responsibility. Oh, that's much better. It's the same thing, but words can be important to people. I'm very happy to change the vocabulary. I'm not wedded to a particular vocabulary, but I would like all of you to use my vocabulary, right? Not because it's new, not because what I'm saying is particularly new, but because it's my way of packaging it, and it'll help to make me famous and important and pay for my children's college education. The last part, now, why do I want to mention the culture? For several reasons. First of all, there's a tendency on the part of people to look at these other institutions and to try to understand the world only in terms of institutions. And so people will just look at science and technology as if it existed in a vacuum. Or economists will tend to look at economic structures, and they are notoriously ignorant of anything else outside of economics. They live in their own world of recreational math. Okay. They do recreational math, not real math. Okay. And people who teach political science tend to look at political institutions as if they sort of function on their own, as if economics had nothing to do with politics, etc. And then there are people who do the law, and they tend to ignore everything else. So what I would argue is that all of these things are integrated, but that the thing that supports all of it is the culture. That without a certain kind of culture, none of these institutions works. Which is why when you attempt to introduce the institution without the cultural context, it's not likely to succeed. So what is this culture of personal autonomy, or culture of freedom and responsibility? Somewhere between the 12th and 15th century, in the West, not elsewhere, we developed the idea of the free and responsible individual. Now, what's behind that idea? Why in the West and not elsewhere? I'll talk a little bit about the idea in a moment, but I want to give its origin. Well, the origin of the notion of the free and responsible individual is in Stoicism, but most especially in Christianity. It is in Christianity that you get the idea that there is an individual who has a soul, and has been given that soul by God, and therefore has a very, very special relationship, and it becomes important in other ways. I'm thinking now of the debate that was held in Spain, I think in the 18th century, about whether or not it was okay to enslave the Indians. And the people who argued in favor of enslaving them used Aristotle's argument about natural slaves. On the other hand, the people who argued against it used the Christian argument and said, we just converted these people to Christianity. They have souls. We cannot enslave them. That's the wrong thing to do. So the whole history of Christianity has been focused on doing away with slavery, has been a major force in doing away with slavery, even when the British did it in the 19th century. One of the great sources behind that was that were among Christians or other sources as well. But the notion of the individual, peculiar to the West. I had a quotation here. Quotation. I said I'm quoting myself. Imagine calling that a quotation. Okay. Sometimes I wonder what my relationship is to my previous writings. I read what I have written and I say, did I say that? What the heck could I possibly have meant by that? I thought I knew at the time. Anyway, there's one particular statement. Am I going to find it or not? It's so politically incorrect, which is really why I wanted to read this statement to you. Okay, here it is. All right. Neither Hinduism nor Buddhism can discern any purpose or meaning. The Tao sees a universe with no personal or meaningful relation to human beings. Neither Taoism nor Confucianism nor Shinto has a meaningful eschatology that can help us to realize the destiny of human beings in the world. Okay? So I know we're not supposed to say politically incorrect things, but when I look at the world's religion, I try to find one that actually promotes the notion of a free, responsible individual. The only one I find that does that is the Judeo-Christian tradition. Now, all of modern moral philosophy, from Hobbes to Locke to Hume to Kant to Hegel to Mill, etc., everybody in the modern period is focused on trying to make sense of the free and responsible individual. In a sense, this is where the two narratives begin to diverge. Those people who made the transition to freedom and responsibility and accepted the responsibility that goes with being a free person, are very different from the people who do not make the transition, who want to be taken care of by others, who think of themselves as members of some kind of large organization, whatever that larger organization might be. Those are the people who we now would refer to as communitarian and who like political structures which are organized from the top down, where they are relieved of making responsible choices on their own behalf. Now, I would advocate that there are lots of other things about Christianity that will help to make this clear. I would say, for example, that we share, insofar as we can liken ourselves to God, we not only share reason with God, we share two other things which I think are more important. And those two other things are free will and imagination. Okay? And I would stress that I think it would be a mistake not to include imagination as an important characteristic that we share in common. And here I'm going to refer you to, this actually is a quote from somebody else. This is a quote from John Paul II. He was addressing a group of business leaders and he made the following claim. He said that man ought to imitate God, his creator, in working. You imitate God by working, because man alone has the unique characteristics of likeness to God, and man shares by his work in the activity of the Creator. So what we share with God is the responsibility of recreating the earth and making it better. All right? We are stewards. We are to protect it. We're also here to improve it. So I think there are lots of ways in which we can connect this particular conception I have of the importance of individuality with the entire story. I would ultimately argue that the only way you can make sense of this is if you believe in free will. And if you believe in free will, then one of the further consequences of that would be that you can't explain the universe simply in scientific terms. If there's something unique about human beings. I could go on and on about that, but that would get us into all kinds of technical, philosophical details that I don't want to bore you with that. I did actually write a very boring 500-page book on this subject, so if you're interested in pursuing it, email me, and if you have $200, I'll tell you what the book is, and you can go out and buy it. Now that's less money than Richard Epstein charges for his latest book, so it's a bargain, at least from the point of view of price. Okay, now what else about this culture of personal autonomy or freedom and responsibility? Here I want to close the loop by drawing a line from that to the technological project. The reason I started with the technological project is that I was trying to capture people's attention who don't necessarily have a theological or philosophical perspective on these things, but they would all recognize that we live in a world which is largely defined by technology. I would now want to argue that the technological project is the spiritual quest of modernity. That the reason we want to control the universe is not to control, at least control in the sense of not being victimized by it, is not simply to get goods. I mean, not that I'm against consumer goods. I actually enjoy them. I try to buy as many as I can. I even buy more than I can afford. It's just not an anti-materialistic stance I'm taking, but rather that there's something more important than that. Beyond a certain point, the purpose of the technological project is to give us opportunities to express our freedom. That what we are doing is creating resources that will enable human beings to go out and do other kinds of things that they could not do when there weren't resources available. So just as some quick implications of this, in the medieval period, nobody worried about poverty because that was assumed to be the norm. In the modern world, where poverty is in principle unnecessary because we no longer live in a zero-sum economic world, poverty for us is a great shade of the problem. We are concerned about trying to find out why is it that some people are poor. And I would argue in the long run that the great explanation for all of this is that they lack the characteristics and virtues of those who are successful in a modern commercial republic. So I don't want to give the impression that this is a purely materialistic account. Quite the contrary, I would argue that in the long run, the reason for making all this money and creating this wealth is to do other great things with it. So material things are not ends in themselves. They're simply means that allow us to achieve the other great things in life that would not be possible if we constantly had to worry about our health, disease, and other threats. Okay, and I just want to add that, okay, I think maybe this will come up in the question period later, but I'm going to now apply this, and I'm getting to the end of my lecture, globalization. Let me say that globalization is exactly the story I have just given you. It is the realization on the part of people that if you want the products of the technological project, the only way you can get that is through a free market economy. That is a very painful lesson for people to learn. Okay? And the only way you're going to get a free market economy is if you have a limited government. And the only way you're going to get a limited government is if you operate by the rule of law. And the only way you're going to get the rule of law is if you have a culture that promotes the notion of free and responsible individuals. To the extent that other cultures have enormous problems, of course it will vary, but I think it's a matter of degree. To the extent that other cultures in the world have problems adjusting to globalization, it is largely because they lack the notion of the free and responsible individual. So I will ask one question, answer it myself, and then conclude. Okay. I would like you to name for me any major conflict in the world today that doesn't involve Muslims. Name a major conflict that does not involve. Major conflict is like people are shooting at each other, killing each other. That's a major conflict. Okay. Not just people yelling at each other across the street. Okay. All right. I would say that almost every, there are 1 or 2 seconds, almost every major conflict in the world today involves Muslims, and the reason for that is that their culture is having the greatest difficulty coming to terms with the fact that you can't have the products of technology and science and markets unless you change your culture and change your attitude. You might even have to take women seriously. Imagine how difficult step that is for some people to make them actually think that women have souls and should be treated on an equal basis. So now I don't think it's impossible for them to do it. I think in time they will actually make the transition, but in the meantime it's a very, very painful one for them to actually do. So I'll conclude by saying that if you want to understand the role of commerce in the modern world, you have to see how commerce is connected to all of these other institutions. And commerce has become the focus of our world largely because it is the linchpin around which all of these things are involved. But I don't want to give a purely materialist interpretation. I would like to say that all of this only makes sense when you understand the larger ethical context in which commerce and politics and other institutions operate for us. And that larger cultural context I would describe as Judeo-Christian. And I think the biggest threat that exists for our particular society is that I don't see how those institutions are going to survive and function well unless there is a larger cultural base where people take, in some form or other, the Judeo-Christian tradition seriously. That, I would argue, is our spiritual capital. That capital might be in the process of being eroded. It's important to prevent that erosion and reassert its importance, because without that, I think there is an inevitable progression to a very materialistic conception of human beings, and that inevitably is going to lead you to some kind of communalistic notion of the economy. And I think in the long run, that will be the actual undoing of the technological project as well.